Morning, everybody. Let's do this third video where I'm gonna touch upon my newest body of work called Salt, Saliva, Metal, and I hope you enjoy it. This series is inspired by screens and their flatness, and in a way the digital space, it's like a very narrow door, right? And in order for us to access its promised spaces and go through that door, we need to just leave many things behind that are deeply important for our sense making in order to fit through that door. And one of the most important things we're leaving behind is our embodied condition. What we're able to express through them is always us depicted as information. It's a little sample of ourselves, but it's never the actual full experience. And another important thing about screens is it's like they're not just a bridge between you and I, but also they are a window utilized by corporations and governments, and that's important to me to recognize. It reminds me of to explain this idea further, what I mean by that, of like the demiurge in Platonic philosophy. The demiurge is this a creative force, right? That it's responsible for shaping and organizing the world. It's an interpreter that is mediating two planes of existence. And in Platonic philosophy, it was like the realm of God and reality in the plane of the earthly. But my suspicion is that the contemporary demiurgical operation is being effectively done by big tech, specifically in California, which proposes this organization of information and this organization of perspective. And I think it reminds me of this song by the band His Name Is Alive, which has the title "There's Something Between Us," and it's changing my words. And so I've been thinking about, I've talked about this on previous clips, about a difficult to pin down agent that is ghostly, transparent, but has an actual effect and in how we develop affection and how we operate in terms of cognition. It's interesting because this notion of this ghostly presence reminds me of movies like Poltergeist, Ringu, which is like The Ring, Videodrome, in which we have a phantasmagoric figure emerging from the television screen and actually entering the real world. And I believe that's a very telling image of this demiurgical figure I'm describing that is operating basically, like under the needs of those silos of power, in particularly big tech and governments. So it's a way of making it visible, and to me they prove very powerful in that regard. Also, this quote from Borges, the Argentinian writer, comes to mind, where he says that mirrors are abominable because they multiply the number of men. But I could argue that in the same vein, screens are abominable because they multiply the amount of information. And going back to this idea of the little door and what we leave behind to enter the promised digital space, art in a way is about resisting the condition of information. So as everything is digitized, it's very difficult to unmagnetize itself from that existence as information. So that's why the notion of the embodiment and the notion of an image as an object is very important. Also, I'm thinking about like a vinyl record, right? Sounding. So it's spinning at a specific speed and in a specific direction. And when those conditions are met, what happens is like we experience a suspension of disbelief, because now a band is just rendered in our living room. And while that is happening, the medium itself almost disappears in order for it to give us the experience of the band playing. But imagine that suddenly a DJ comes and just pushes his finger against the record, slowing it down, and instantly the music has this now darker pitch, and everything goes slow, and to the point that the record actually stops and there's nothing but silence. And if then you allow it or you push it a little bit forward and then backward, you'll have the scratch. And what's happening there is that the medium itself is now expressing, is the mediumness of the vinyl record is being rendered as this scratch noise. So that notion of how a medium can behave almost invisibly to render a clean depiction of a real world phenomena, but then its own inherent poetic emerges, right, and becomes, let's say, noise. There's a beautiful tension between this signal to noise ratio, if you want to put it in those terms. And what interests me about that regarding this collection is that liminal point in which the medium is carrying a signal, in this case the images, but also the medium is rendering itself. So that's very beautiful, because it's expressing two dimensions, and that dimension of the medium, in my opinion, goes beyond language. I'm gonna illustrate this further with a little story. Some months ago, some really intense gusts of wind roamed across the city, and they were so intense that it started ripping billboards apart. I was driving and I was witnessing these empty frames just showing the skyline throughout the city. At one point I stopped and I had my camera with me, and this is the one I'm showing you right now. it was incredible for me to witness. It's the condition of the billboard as a sign, that in this case it was promoting an action. It was a sale. It was promoting for us to buy something, and but then it got ripped apart. And what happened is like its physical aspect became apparent as it was undulating. And by the way, there's something interesting about flags, as they're being moved by the wind, because you have this weird balance between their condition as a container of a sign and then their physicality, the mediumness in themselves. And so at some point the billboard just ripped and completely detached from the structure and flew through the air, landed on the street, on top of a group of cars, and caused an actual traffic accident. To be able to witness that transduction or even a transmogrification between a sign that is semiotical in its nature, and then as it goes through the air, it becomes fully embodied and now becomes just this plastic blanket. And to see it cause an effect in real life just because of its physicality was what I described as a note-taking moment. And I have to say that also happened with the flag in the city where I live here. There's a huge Mexican flag, and we had a storm, and the thing dislodged itself and flew. And so we have the Mexican flag flying on top of several neighborhoods until it just landed on top of houses and vehicles. I don't know if it landed actually on top of people too, but it's just this weird symbol now causing a wreck. And again, this is important because in the making of this work, I was really thinking about that billboard, about that flag, that with their dual nature, I was very aware of it. So that's one of the reasons, for instance, why several of the titles in this collection are, for instance, CAS, which is CAS, which means Chemical Abstract Service. And what CAS is imagine like a dictionary of substances, known substances to man, and they have a number so that you can, like, if you are an industry or big pharma or whatever, you can order them and work with those specific materials. But there's something really pointing at the substance aspect that I really like. Also in the case of color itself, I was conceptualizing it as deployable material, as a thing in itself. And when I say substance, I'm talking about not like rhetorical density, but the physical aspect of things. And so, there's a flirtatious relationship with the sculptural dimension and how much of that is available to the digital image. Also, coming back to this idea of the billboard and the rip, I was fantasizing about like somebody standing outside a Walmart and then having this crazy winds, and suddenly a W falls right from the facade and just lands on top of somebody and hits that person in the head. So that could be a case of killed by a W. And what I mean by that again is this weird coming and going between the notion of something as just being a sign and then becoming an actual physical object. Now, in this series, it's been the first time in a while that I'm not using a printed advertisement as a starting point to construct further images, but in this case, I use my own photography. That's why I describe these images as displaced photographs, like photograph stretch further to the point that it becomes something else. And also, I've been asked, why are we seeing all these candles, routers, and in some images, even a bone can be told apart. And I was envisioning this tension, right, between, again, first of all, a more modern object and an object pointing at, let's say, it's just a previous mode of technology, and how, in many ways, both of them bring people together with a completely different logic, and also there's like almost a metaphysical idea there, because the candle, to me, in many ways, it implies prayer, and you could even understand prayer as this form of wireless communication, of accessing a different plane, and in all the rituals we've built around a candle and what it means. And then now the router presupposes a different kind of reaching out with a different logic. And in my opinion, most of these technologies, especially now with AI, it's basically going to engulf the internet and become the internet itself, become the new search engine. To me, that technology, it's deeply embedded with American perspectives and American values, and not only that, but the values of transnational corporations, and how they are recolonizing the globe. And so there's some kind of resistance that I think it's healthy. Another thing, I've been talking a lot about the digital being a narrow door that it's like a funnel, right? That in order for us to go through, we have to leave some things behind. And I've been talking about suddenly the moment where the medium expresses itself beyond beyond the information it contains. And in many ways, the medium is our humanity, clearly. And when we are interacting digitally, it is my belief that we slowly become that shadow in the cave that was depicted by Plato. It's not, and as we became that, and as we become those shadows, it's not our full incarnated nature that is expressing, but only a dimension, and which is a very cerebral, frontal cortex one, and there are some very ancient, primitive aspects that are not expressing themselves, and I believe there's going to be a deep need for that. So, yeah, well, I think this sums up this presentation. Let me see. I'm just thinking about. Well, let me get a little bit more into some of the titles of the pieces. There's one called like iron oxide, and then it has its cast number also. It's all red and looks iridescent and metallic, and also, iron oxide is found in hemoglobin, in blood. I'm just pointing constantly at the bodily dimension. There's another piece called LD50 murine, and LD50 is just like a measurement used in toxicology to determine the lethal or toxic potency of a substance. LD50 represents the dosing in which that substance is estimated to cause 50% of a test population. And so just to point at the notion that a substance can become a poison and can have an effect, a bodily one, etc., is just that recurrent, again, operation I'm doing here to point at physicality. So yeah, I invite you to look at the titles closer and try to go further into what they're implying. As usual, I'm hoping you find a lot of little cues here and there that enriches your experience of the collection, and I hope you give yourself the time to look at them up close. And all the images in the collection are optimized for a 4K screen, so I think you can I hope you have a good glance at them. They're very nuanced, and I think they offer their own notion of beauty and richness. And see you next time with another clip. Please, if you find some of this interesting, please, I would appreciate if you subscribe to the channel and leave me a comment. Those things keep me going. And thank you again. See you soon. Bye.